Have you ever wondered why the Indian Constitution became such a detailed and comprehensive document? It did not appear suddenly in 1950. In fact, many of its features evolved gradually over nearly 200 years of British rule in India. Welcome to PS Choudhary. Before we move ahead, let us briefly recall what we studied in the previous lecture. In the previous video, we understood why India needed a constitution. We discussed how India in 1947 was a newly independent country with more than 350 million people, hundreds of princely states, many languages, and enormous diversity. Without a common framework of rules, governing such a country would have been extremely difficult. We also learned that a constitution performs three important functions. It tells us how the government is organized, it protects the rights of citizens, and it establishes that the government ultimately serves the people. Now, in this lecture, we will move to the historical background that shaped our constitution. To understand this, we need to look at the British constitutional acts passed between 1773 and 1947. Now let us understand the big idea first. British rule in India was not static. The British continuously changed the way India was governed. Every major change was introduced through an act passed by the British Parliament in London. These acts are extremely important because many features of the Indian Constitution actually evolved from them. You can think of it as a 200-year constitutional experiment. Whenever a problem arose in the administration of India, the British tried to fix it by passing a new act. Over time, these acts became more detailed and more complex. By the time the Government of India Act of 1935 was enacted, it had become the most elaborate constitutional framework for India. In fact, many provisions of the Indian Constitution were directly adapted from that act. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself acknowledged that several structural elements of our Constitution were influenced by the Government of India Act, 1935. Now remember this mental model. It is very useful for UPSC. Every major act can be understood as two things: a problem that existed earlier, and a solution introduced through the new act. UPSC often tests questions in exactly this way. For example, the examiner may ask which act introduced a particular feature for the first time. So understanding the chronological development becomes very important. Now let us begin with the first major step. The first important act was the Regulating Act of 1773. This act marked the first time the British Parliament intervened directly in the affairs of the East India Company. Until then, the East India Company had been running India largely as a commercial enterprise. But by the early 18th century, the company had acquired significant political power, and the British government felt the need to regulate its activities. Under the Regulating Act of 1773, the position of Governor-General of Bengal was created. The first person to hold this position was Warren Hastings. Remember this carefully. Warren Hastings was the first Governor-General of Bengal, not the Governor-General of India. This distinction is very important for UPSC. Another major feature of this act was the establishment of the Supreme Court at Calcutta in 1774. The court had 4 judges. The act also required the Court of Directors of the East India Company to submit reports to the British Crown about the administration of India. In addition, company servants were prohibited from engaging in private trade or accepting gifts. Now let us move to the next important act. The Pitt's India Act of 1784 introduced the concept of dual government. This act separated the political and commercial functions of the East India Company. A new body called the Board of Control was created. It had 6 members appointed by the British Crown and it supervised political affairs in India. At the same time, the Court of Directors continued to manage the commercial activities of the company. This arrangement effectively made the East India Company subordinate to the British Crown for the first time. The territories in India were also officially referred to as British possessions in India. Now let us look at the Charter Act of 1793. This act did not introduce very major structural changes. It mainly renewed the company's trade monopoly for another 20 years. However, it did allow the Governor-General's decisions to override those of his council. It also provided that the salaries of the Board of Control would be paid from Indian revenues. Next, the Charter Act of 1813 brought an important change. It ended the East India Company's monopoly over trade with India. However, two exceptions remained. The company retained its monopoly over the tea trade and trade with China. Another important development was that Christian missionaries were now allowed to enter India. The Act also provided a grant of 1 lakh rupees per year for education in India. This was the first official education grant. Now we come to one of the most important Charter Acts. The Charter Act of 1833. This act centralized the administration of British India. One very important change was that the Governor-General of Bengal was redesignated as the Governor-General of India. The first Governor-General of India was Lord William Bentinck. Remember this clearly. Warren Hastings was the first Governor-General of Bengal, but Lord William Bentinck became the first Governor-General of India. Another major feature of this act was the end of the East India Company's commercial activities. From this point onward, the company functioned only as an administrative body. The Act also created the first Law Commission under the chairmanship of Lord Macaulay. There was also an attempt to introduce open competition for civil services, although it was later dropped under pressure from the company. Another important provision stated that there should be no discrimination in public services on the basis of religion, birth, or color. Now let us move to the Charter Act of 1853. This was the last Charter Act passed by the British Parliament for the East India Company. It introduced one major reform. Civil services were open to competitive examination. This meant that recruitment to the Indian civil service would now be based on merit through open competition. The Act also created a separate legislative council at the central level. This body functioned somewhat like an early form of parliament. For the first time, local representatives were included in the legislative process. The British Parliament also reserved the right to take over the administration of India in the future. Now a major turning point came after the revolt of 1857. In response to this uprising, the British government passed the Government of India Act of 1858. This act abolished the East India Company and transferred the administration of India directly to the British Crown. A new position called the Secretary of State for India was created. This person was a member of the British Cabinet and was assisted by a council of 15 members. The Governor-General of India was now also called the Viceroy, representing the British monarch in India. The doctrine of lapse was also abandoned after this act. Now let us look at the Indian Councils Act of 1861. This act marked the beginning of decentralization in administration. It enlarged the legislative councils and, for the first time, Indians were nominated as non-official members in these councils. The Viceroy was also given the power to issue ordinances in emergency situations. Another important administrative innovation was the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning. This system later became the foundation of the cabinet system in India. Legislative powers were also partially decentralized to provinces like Bombay and Madras. Now the Indian Councils Act of 1892 introduced further reforms. It increased the number of non-official members in legislative councils. Indirect elections were introduced. Members were recommended by various bodies, although the elections were not yet direct. Legislative councils were also allowed to discuss the budget, though they still did not have the power to vote on it. Members were allowed to ask questions to the executive. This practice is known as interpellation. Next comes a very controversial reform. The Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morlaminto Reforms. This act introduced direct elections for the first time. But its most controversial provision was the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims. Under this system, Muslim voters would elect their own representatives separately. This decision had long-term political consequences and later contributed to communal divisions. Another significant development was that Indians were now appointed to the executive councils. Sachendra Prasanna Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's executive council. The size of legislative councils was also increased. Now let us move to the Government of India Act of 1919. This act is associated with the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Its most important feature was the introduction of diarchy in the provinces. Under diarchy, provincial subjects were divided into two categories. Transferred subjects were handled by Indian ministers responsible to the legislature. Reserved subjects remained under the control of the governor and his executive council. The act also introduced a bicameral legislature at the centre. This meant there were now two houses, the Council of State and the Legislative Assembly. The Act also provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. The franchise was expanded and separate electorates were extended to Sikhs. Another important change was that the central budget was separated from provincial budgets. India also became a member of the League of Nations. Now we arrive at the most important constitutional act before independence. The Government of India Act of 1935. This act was the most elaborate constitutional framework introduced by the British. It contained more than 300 sections and 10 schedules. One of its major proposals was the creation of an all-India federation consisting of the centre, provinces, and princely states. However, this federation was never actually formed. Another very important feature was provincial autonomy. Under this system, provinces were given responsible governments and elected ministries exercised real administrative powers. The Act also proposed diarchy at the centre, although this provision was never implemented. It introduced a bicameral legislature at the central level. Another very important feature was the creation of 3 legislative lists. These were the federal list, the provincial list, and the concurrent list. You will notice that a very similar system exists in the Indian Constitution today under the 7th Schedule. The Act also established the Federal Court, which later became the basis for the Supreme Court of India. It created the Reserve Bank of India and provided for both federal and provincial public service commissions. Franchise was expanded and elections were held in 1937. In those elections, the Indian National Congress formed governments in 7 out of 11 provinces. Many features of this act were later incorporated into the Constitution of Independent India. For example, the idea of federalism, the system of legislative lists, the role of governors in provinces, the federal court structure, and the public service commissions. Now finally we come to the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This act ended British rule in India. It created 2 independent dominions, India and Pakistan, on the 15th of August 1947. The Government of India Act of 1935 continued to function as the interim constitutional framework until the new constitution was adopted. The constituent assemblies of India and Pakistan became fully sovereign bodies. The Governor-General became the constitutional head representing the Dominion. In India's case, Lord Mountbatten served as the first Governor-General after independence. Another important consequence was that the British paramountcy over princely states came to an end. This allowed the princely states to decide whether to join India or Pakistan. Now let us quickly revise the most important points. First, British constitutional development in India happened through a series of acts passed between 1773 and 1947. Second, these acts gradually shaped the administrative and constitutional framework that later influenced the Indian Constitution. Third, the Government of India Act of 1935 was the most important of these acts and became the primary structural source for many provisions of the Indian Constitution. And finally, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 ended British rule and allowed the Constituent Assembly to frame the Constitution of Independent India. In the next lecture, we will move forward and understand the demand for the Constituent Assembly and how the process of constitution making actually began in India.